Tonight I want to talk about a specific area, that is the predator himself, or on occasion herself, but is predominant male, and that is a pedophile. And I know that you hear this name a lot. Let me give you a layperson definition of pedophile. Generally, it means that it is an adult whose sexual preferences and or desires or sexual gratification comes from having sexual activity or relationships with children. And in this definition, we are talking about the prepubescent child. So we're talking about very young children. I think you have to ask yourself to begin with, why do pedophiles become pedophiles, or indeed do they become? This is an academic exercise, so let's talk about just very generally. Let's take a look at three explanations of the pedophilic personality. The first one is a biological explanation, and that is there something different or abnormal or aberrant concerning the physiological development of the brain or some other aspect in terms of the physical aspects? Predominantly, we are talking about the biology of brain, or perhaps something in relationship to the biology of the sex drive as it relates to the male, and perhaps hormones such as testosterone. There are a number of explanations out there. They tend to be very esoteric. By that I mean they can be very complex, and I'm not too sure if it would serve any purpose in elaborating greatly. But generally, I just want you to know that there is some research and literature that attempts to explain pedophilia from a biological perspective. I'll give you an example. In the Massachusetts penal system, there was a guy there by the name of Dr. Nicholas Groth. Groth was very prevalent in the literature in the 80s and early 90s. And for example, he wrote a really interesting text entitled Men Who Rape. And then he took his research from that perspective, and then he looked at men who rape children. And one of the things that he came up with was an interesting and quite controversial treatment program or modality for these individuals. And it went something like this. If you were convicted of sexual molestation of a child in Massachusetts, you tended to do a lot of time, especially if it was a form of penetration, which would make it a first-degree sexual assault. And after doing a number of your years, you could enter into Groth's program if you would do the following. One, you entered into a 3-year intensive treatment program with him. Group counseling, individual one-on-one therapies. Then 2, upon your release, you would agree to continue your therapy on the outside. And you would be assigned to a group, and you have to meet that group every week, on occasion, the individual therapy. Now, where the controversy came in is number 3. You would have to agree to inject yourself or allow yourself to be injected with a hormone called Depo-Provera. And what they found over a period of time, that Depo-Provera will reduce the male libido, your sex drive, down to that of a child, 8, 9 years old. Interestingly, it did seem to work. You would think of it as a chemical castration. What they also found is that a number of the individuals, statistically too high, who participated in this, began to develop high instances of testicle cancer. They began to develop breast, and their faces began to soften and have soft features of that as a female. I do not think the program continues, but it was something that was tried early on in the 70s and 80s. The second explanation, and there is just a litany of literature in this area, is the psychological explanation of the pedophilic behavior. And there you can go back to early childhood experiences. You can go back to anger, and this is a way to release your anger. You can go to control issues. There's any number of research that you could read in this particular area that would suggest that you are indeed pedophilic because of a psychological abnormality. And then third, and the last one we'll talk about, is the sociological explanation. Here you are because you have been socialized yourself. This is the way that you express your sexual feelings, because perhaps when you were a child, you were molested yourself. You internalize that behavior, and even if it is negative, you still believe that that is the way that you express yourself sexually because it was done to you. Now, let me just jump in and give you kind of a parenthetical, kind of an aside to that. I remember in the prison that just by chance, I was reading a number of files of some of the prisoners doing my own research, and I noticed that there were high incidences of case studies where when you go to prison, one of the things that's going to happen to you is you are going to have a number of people who their job is to analyze the crime and the victims and also then you. And I began to notice in reading those files that there was a really high incidence of people convicted of child molestation, suggesting that they were indeed victims of child molestation themselves. Something that's significant because it can be a mitigating circumstance. Now, you don't have to be a lawyer. Let me just give you two words. In terms of sentencing, now you have been indicted and you have been convicted. Now it's time to be sentenced. One of the things that your attorney is going to do is convince the court that you should not go to prison, or if you go to prison, it should be for a minimal term. So they have to come up with mitigating circumstances. And those are circumstances that would lessen the degree of your criminality. Now, the opposite of that is aggravating circumstances. So an aggravating circumstance would be that not only did you molest the child, but you took videos of the child and then sent those videos of you molesting the child to the parents. That's an aggravating circumstance. Mitigating is you would tell the court through your attorney that you were indeed molested yourself as a child. And you thought that this was the way that, even though you knew it was wrong, but still you internalized and you really thought this was the way that you expressed yourself. Or you were angry by what happened to you, and you just continued that anger onto the next generation. That's a mitigating circumstance. And what I found interesting is I really didn't see much of that until I began to read the files of prisoners who were convicted in the late 1970s and 80s and on. And I stopped looking at the files in the early 2000s. What's that mean? Well, I think it could be that either the attorneys would perhaps suggest that we need to come up with some mitigating circumstances, and maybe if you were molested, you better tell me now, because we can perhaps use that to get you a lesser sentence. Or it may be that word of mouth, because most of these individuals tend to be in jail for some time before they're released, or they never get out of jail as they go through the trial process before they go to prison. And in jail, you have nothing but time and a lot of people who are willing to give you a lot of advice who are also in jail themselves. So it becomes a word of mouth. Just something to consider. When you read the literature, read it with a critical eye. Now, I want to give you a different, less complex analysis of the pedophilic personality. We like to look at it in terms of our research. We look at it as at a continuum, and I think I mentioned this before in a previous lecture. What we found is that you can explain this complex behavior by looking at a continuum. If you remember, I said on the left of that continuum are people such as ourselves, who have no problems, no fantasies in regards to being around children, to thinking about them sexually is just simply not part of our psyche. And then you can move towards the right, and the stronger that pedophilic personality becomes, and the more you are involved in that seduction process of children. So I have chapter 2 that we wrote regarding background and explanation of pedophilic behavior, and you can read that at your leisure. Again, looking at the theories, to recap, there are biological explanations, there are psychological explanations, and there are sociological explanations, especially in the area of socialization. And then, as we suggest, you can put all of those together and put it on a continuum of behavior if you are attempting to identify pedophilic behavior. Not necessarily an explanation, but identifying them. People on the right will spend most of their energy in their waking hours in the pursuit of children for sexual purposes. It's hard to talk about pedophilic behavior in general terms, but we need to do that because I need to give you just a little bit of background, and we are going to go from the general to the specific. But right now, I'm talking about pedophilia in general, not necessarily just cybercrime and predators online. I mean pedophilia after the pedophile meets the child. They talk online, they form a relationship online, but at some point, they have to come together and they have to meet. In terms of that, I have some general characteristics that I'd like to share with you. In reviewing the literature, this has not changed in the past 25 or 30 years drastically, even with the advent of the web and online predators. They still will have these characteristics, again, if they're to the right of that continuum. Predominantly, they are male. I don't think you are going to find very many instances of a female who is involved in pedophilic behavior. What you may find, if you review some of the cases and if you review law journals, what you may find are women who are involved in prostitution, who perhaps may solicit a child, especially their own children. But are they pedophilic? We find generally not. Interesting also in this culture, in terms of age, I think there is a misconception or a myth that a pedophile is that person that is old and has scraggly clothes and is ugly in the beard. That's not true at all. Anybody that you know could be one. And I don't mean that as a scare characteristic. I mean that it's just like any other criminal behavior. There isn't one characteristic or one physical feature that's going to distinguish that individual. In terms of age, we find that they can be very young. They can be 9, 10, 11 years old. One of the things that we found is that when a child in the neighborhood is sexually assaulted or molested, then they may take that behavior and start to do it to their friends. I remember interviewing a mother where it was passing on the poison, if you will. It then ranges from the very young, which is unusual, but it happens, to the people in their 50s and 60s. But generally, if you would review the prison population, I think what you're going to find, at least the people who are arrested and convicted and sentenced, I think you'll find the majority of them to be between the ages of 30 and 60, somewhere in there. But there is not, my point being, any one predominant age group, although it is predominant, it is male. In terms of looking at race, this may change because I don't think there's been a great deal of research in this particular area of other cultures. But one of the things that it seems to be, at least in this culture at this time, it is a Caucasian crime. You will not find other minorities engaged in pedophilic behavior generally. But as I say, that may change. It may be we're simply not looking. But it does, at this point, seem to be predominantly a white male between the ages of, say, 30 to 60, somewhere in there. That tends to be the physical characteristics. Another one, are they married? And the answer to that is yes, in many instances. And also, many of them have children, which makes the behavior complex. Let me give you several personal examples of interviews that I conducted in terms of the marriage status from the prison cell block. The number of pedophiles I interviewed were married and they had children, and no, they did not practice this behavior on their children, and no, in many instances, their wives did not know. This was this hidden behavior. This was the second personality that they didn't share or that their family never found out about until they were busted on the outside of the family. It tends to be, in talking to them, it is on the very extreme right of that continuum. These are individuals who may use their family as a way to hide their behavior, as a way to present themselves with normality, but yet then it allows them to practice the behavior in terms of the marriage status. People that I talked to suggested that while they had these urges growing up and as young men, they did not succumb to them. It was only after they were married and then had their own children that these strong urges of having relationships with other children began to emerge and then ultimately taking over their personality. Again, this is a complex behavior. Their education ranges just like it would if you would study murder, people who rape adults, people who commit violent crimes to adults. They tend to be illiterate, and they range into having 4-year degrees or law degrees, or even people who practice medicine with MDs. Doctors do rape and murder, as do lawyers. However, it is unusual. It seems to be that with children, you are going to find more of this, the highly educated, than you will in terms of them committing violent crimes, even crimes of sexual assault to adult female. But there is no one level of education that you'll find to represent the majority. They will range from illiterate to those who are very highly educated and skilled. This does seem to be in relation at least to those who we found in the prison system and interviewed, and then also the research supports us in what we suggested as part of the behavior. And that is, there will be specific items that will distinguish them from other types of criminal groups. Let me give you an example of that. One thing is, and it relates to the explosion of child pornography on the internet, and that is these individuals, again, moving to the right of the continuum, these individuals have an obsession, and that is the word. It is an obsession to create and to possess child pornography. It simply is very much part of the characteristics of the behavior. I know that you are not interested in the aspects of putting together a search warrant, but it's interesting to note that when the police believe that they are investigating a person who is involved in this kind of activity as a pedophile, they will put in the search warrant. They want to be able to look for places where child pornography can be stored, such as a computer hard drive, or where it can be hidden, such as a floor or a false wall. It is an obsession with these individuals. Another one that goes along with the obsessive personality is you will find that many of them who have the ability to write that is, they are not illiterate, have a need to memorialize their sexual activities with children. And they will have extensive diaries or journals that will either depict the sexual relationships they have had with children, or it will be just paragraphs upon pages where they are discussing their sexual fantasies and what they want to do with children. These, I think, are telltale signs. If you believe that you are investigating as a law enforcement officer, you are investigating somebody who you believe is involved in this, these are things that you want to look for. Also, I would suggest that if you are teachers or in the educational system, you may want to realize these characteristics as well, because you are the ones who are going to be on the front line with the victims, the children themselves. It would really behoove you, if you believe that you are dealing with a child who perhaps is being victimized, that you ask these kind of questions in regards to photographs being taken of you. Have you been shown pornography, which is also part of the importance of pornography to the child predator. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Another characteristic of the child predator is to have, I'm going to call them lures, because again, once you meet the child, you have to be able to create the persona of a child. You have to be able to be 12, 13, 14 years old, maybe a little younger and maybe a little older. But once you get past the persona and you have developed that trust in cyberspace, then it's time to do other things. You need to have lures. And that is, once you meet the child, then you need to have reasons for them to continue to want to meet you. So it may be gifts that you will bestow. It may be video games, but there will be something that once you get past that initial meeting, that the child wants to continue to be your friend. And having lures of all types, toys, video games, as I said, is very much part of the pedophilic personality and characteristics. And the last one I'll mention, again, these are just general characteristics. These people tend to be very social as a criminal group. And there are a number of organizations that are out there that are for the purpose of allowing pedophiles to have places where they can meet online, or even physically have places where they can meet each other. Some of the ones that I'll mention, perhaps you have heard of them. I am giving you these because I don't want you to go there and find them, because this can only cause trouble. And I do not think that you're going to be able to do that. But the two that I'll mention is NAMBLA, which was created in the 1970s. NAMBLA stands for North American Man Boy Love Association. And there was at one time several addresses that you could find. Why would you want to join NAMBLA? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, you'll get to know, because they will send you lists of pedophiles in your region. You can meet them online, you can send letters to each other, and you can ultimately set up places where you can meet. One of the things that they like to do is exchange child pornography. Again, this is a really important part of the personality. I'm sure you're saying to yourself, well, where are the police? Yes, police are involved in these organizations. But there are ways that you can get around that in terms of keeping the police out. For example, what the organization will do is they'll have parties. And they'll say that to get into the party, be sure that you bring a photograph of you and a child in a sexual compromising position. In other words, the child is performing oral sex or you are performing oral sex. Is a police officer going to do that? Absolutely not. So if you don't have that kind of photograph, you are not going to get into the meeting. Again, the purpose of the meeting is not only to reinforce each other's values, because the world sees you as perverse. You don't see yourself that way. The men that I talk to, and the ones that you can read about in the literature, will say how they love children. And this is their way of expressing their love. They will say NAMBLA's purpose was to deal with the kids on the street, the throwaways, the runaways, those homeless kids, and bring them in and protect them. What they don't say is when the child begins to grow up, that is, becomes a young man, they lose their sexual interest in that child. So now the child has been hurt dramatically twice. Once by his parents, and then once by the person whom he trusted and developed a relationship with, and then throws him back out into the street several years after they meet and after a lot of sexual activity. Another reason for the organizations is it allows them to develop literature, news articles. They will send out the ones that I got from the literature were 5 or 6 pages of mimeographed articles expressing what I'm talking to you about, why it is okay for them to do what they do as you read the article, that they are not perverse, they are not abnormal, and it is us, the strays, who simply don't understand. Let me give you another one. This one's kind of interesting because it offers a different twist. The other one that I'll mention is PIE, P-I-E, and PIE is Pedophile Information Exchange. And this one was international, where NAMBLA was more of a North American, and its purpose was to work with the travel industry. And I was going to, for example, China. I am going to China next month. So I would contact PIE, and PIE would put me in touch with a representative who knows what I want. And I would tell them that I would like to have a little Chinese 9-year-old waiting for me, and that will accompany me as I stay in the country for a week or two. So PI offered the international information exchange for pedophilic behaviors and also give them tips and places where they could go to solicit children and do it predominantly in a safe manner. Now, that gives you some idea of a general background to the pedophilic personality. I would suggest that you read what I have online. It is the information that we put together in our manuscript in the sexual predator